of you who are not part of the Pathways team and may not know, I want to introduce Mary Scholl, who is the manager of the Pathways to Resilience project. And she's going to be joining us soon, helping to facilitate the dialogue.
Hi, everyone. Mary Scholl. I'm seated at NIBNR, the Narragansett Bay Research Reserve. As Dolores mentioned, I'm kind of supporting the Pathways to Resilience project. So if anyone has any questions about that project at large, I'd be happy to chat. Otherwise, I'm just happy you're all here today.
Like me too. Okay, all right. So a little bit about the project and the panelists who have very graciously agreed to spend some time with us today, and then we can dig into the panel and the dialogue. This webinar is currently the last of several learning opportunities that have been created by the Pathways to Resilience project. And for those of you who don't know, this is a reserve-led initiative to collaborate with partners and communities to ID, protect, and manage the pathways through which wetlands can migrate as sea levels rise. So we're hoping that as part of all of this work, there are 6 pilot sites in the National Estuarine Research Reserve system that are participating, but we're hoping it becomes the seed of maybe a community of practice in the reserve system around this topic. So that's why one of the reasons we're doing these webinars. We're extremely grateful to the support of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's America the Beautiful Challenge program, the Pew Charitable Trust, and to NERA, which is also part of our project team and has created a home for this work at nera.org. Mary's going to drop that in the chat for us. If you ever want to know what's happening in terms of webinars like these or what the Pathways to Resilience project is up to, we've been posting updates to that page. So for today, in this virtual panel, we're going to hear from some veteran conservation leaders on the East and West Coasts about how their land trusts work to protect and restore natural habitats in their watershed while balancing sustainable development in a changing climate. Super complex challenges that they face every day. And we've asked them today to focus particularly on their experience and knowledge as it relates to efforts to protect migration pathways for wetlands. So they're going to share and discuss case studies from their work, some tips and best practices from building consensus among diverse stakeholders and nurturing connections between people and protected lands, and also sharing insights into next steps for pathway protection in the land conservation world. So I'll do a quick round robin introduction of each of them, and then we can get right into some brief presentations. They're going to share a little bit of their work with you first, and then we're going to have some dialogue on some questions that we've developed together. So from the East Coast side, we have Alex Wolf from Scenic Hudson. Alex is a conservation scientist at Scenic Hudson, and he conducts research and analyses pertaining to the Hudson Valley's natural resources, with a particular focus on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, as well as the ecology and conservation of local flora and fauna. Before Scenic, he was a researcher at several institutions, including the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies, who I think has been a partner for several of our reserves, and the Missouri Department of Conservation. Alex is here with Seth McKee, who leads Scenic Hudson's efforts to conserve land, create new parks and preserves, and help the valley's cities protect and enhance their land assets, their local history, and their culture in an inclusive and equitable way. He's been with Scenic since 1991. He was a land projects manager now, and he became the director of land conservation in 2007. And he's been the executive director of Scenic Hudson Land Trust and Land Program since 2021. So lots of hats, but the same organization for a good long time. And I'm very excited for him to share the work they've been doing. From the West Coast and the Elkhorn Slough Reserve and Foundation, we have Kevin Contreras. He's the Land Acquisitions and Conservation Easement Manager for the Slough, for the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, which, if you're not familiar with, is the Friends Group for the Elkhorn Slough Reserve, and they are a conservation land trust on California's Central Coast. The foundation and the reserve work closely together on many things. And so he works with reserve staff that many of you may be familiar with. He has a background in economics and geography, and since 2001, he has led the acquisition of 3,000 acres of conservation land in 40 transaction projects valued at $50 million. He's completed work on several highway habitat mitigation planning projects, which is a topic that may come up today. We're all very interested in. And he helped develop a regional land acquisition plan with the reserve. Monique Fountain is the director of the tidal wetland program at the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. This program is a collaborative approach to estuary-wide strategic planning that brings science to management using an ecosystem-based management approach. And it regularly engages more than 100 scientists and stakeholders, or has been doing that since 2004. It's completely grant funded and unique, so you won't find a tidal wetland program at every reserve in the system. And we're also fortunate to have Mark Silberstein on the call. He's the executive director of the foundation, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. And he also was a founding staffer on the Elkhorn Slough Reserve. He was the first research and education coordinator there decades ago. Mark's background is in marine zoology and ecology, and he works with diverse partners to conserve and restore Elkhorn Slough and its watershed and oversee administration of grants, which can be a thankless task, and I'm sure we all thank him for that, to support the reserve and to increase the resilience of this coastal treasure. So thank you all for joining us today. And I believe that the Elkhorn Slough folks won or lost the towing costs, depending on how you look at it. So we'll pass it over to them.
Helps to come off mute. Thank you, Dolores. I'm Monique Fountain. I'm, as you mentioned, the director of the Tidal Wetland Program here at the Elkhorn Slough NER, and I've worked very closely with the foundation on a number of projects.
I'm Kevin Contreras, Elkhorn Slough Foundation. I wanted to cover our mission. The Elkhorn Slough Foundation's mission is to conserve and restore Elkhorn Slough in its watershed.
Hello?
We are
no,
in.
Let's just get ready to hop on a meeting. What's going on with you?
Someone needs to mute. Thank you. We work in a landscape that has a lot of human uses. There's industry, there's agriculture, there's residential, there's even industrial, and so we're really trying to find a way of protecting a place where both nature and people can thrive. I wanted to give us a little context to our work. I think that was one of our charges. We're going to look at a protected lands map here when it comes up.
Okay, so I'm going to start with where Elkhorn Slough is.
Yep, I'll follow.
All right, so the Elkhorn Slough is here in the middle of California in Monterey Bay. It's a 7-mile long coastal embayment that empties into the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And just to give you a flavor of the place, it's set within a working landscape. And like other estuaries, the slough is a rich ecosystem with a diverse array of species and complex food webs. Portions of the slough are designated a Ramsar site, marine protected area, state ecological reserve, and a wildlife management area. And the slough is also an important stop on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. This is a unique environment that draws people to the slough, creating an economic engine driven by ecotourism. And so the bottom line is that Elkhorn Slough is a high-value system, both ecologically and economically.
Now we're looking at the protected lands map of the western part of our watershed. I'm going to use the mouse as a cursor to point out this Monterey Bay to the left with the massive submarine canyon that leads to the 7-mile long tidal embayment that we call Elkhorn Slough, which is surrounded by tidal wetland. To the left, we have a marine terrace that has a lot of agriculture and also some freshwater ponds and wetlands that support rare amphibians. The slough is fed primarily by fresh water from this drainage. This is an ephemeral creek that drains from the east to the west that harbors freshwater wetland and willow riparian forest. And then to the east is a series of old sand dunes that have been stabilized by vegetation. Primarily those are oak woodland habitat, but also maritime chaparral, which folks might not be familiar with. It's a rare plant type, a community type that has 3 manzanita species. If you're familiar with manzanitas, they have that beautiful red, peeling, twisting bark. But you might think like that's not very diverse, but the diversity is in the edges of the maritime chaparral where there are rare plants. And so it's considered an environmentally sensitive habitat on par with wetlands in terms of regulatory oversight. They are rare because they only grow in sand dunes near the coast, which is a pretty rare combination. Our area in general is part of the California Floristic Province, which is most of California without the deserts, excluding the deserts. And that's one of the 25 or so world hotspots of areas that are rich in biodiversity and also under significant threat from development. Now we're going to go to one of our projects. You know, one of the roles of a land trust, and particularly the foundation, is to pre-acquire land and then transfer them to the appropriate land management agencies. So we've completed 9 of these transfers over the last 15 years or so. There are 9 different properties that are about 300 acres in total and are valued at about $10 million. We're looking at a 200-acre parcel here that Monique's going to talk about that was transferred in 2009, and this was appraised and bought for about $4.7 million.
So the wetland portion of this property was historically diked and drained, and you can see the remnant dikes along in here. And so it subsided. And the other thing to note about this is over here on the left-hand side, you can see that the slough has relatively steep slopes, and so not a lot of place for marsh migration. So adding this property to the reserve allowed us to essentially put in a vertical migration space, or as Dolores said earlier, an elevator for the marsh. And we raised subsided land to high in the tidal prism. And in addition, we scraped the soil off to fill this area. So in doing that, we created an additional 14 acres of marsh, and we gently sloped this area so that we have space now for marsh migration in the future. And then I think I'm going on to our second project. So our second project, I'd like to talk about our ridgeline to tideline initiative on the eastern side of the slough. This is a broad initiative that includes retiring unsustainable farmland on steep slopes, reducing groundwater overdraft, restoring degraded wetlands on the reserve, and tackling the issue of transportation infrastructure. Let's see, oops, no, I have that. That's already experiencing overtopping. So this is to ensure that we can maximize our, well, it's not coming up, is it? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be coming up.
Down right there.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so here we go. You can see this. This is another look at that same area from a different angle. And so we're tackling this issue of transportation infrastructure that's already experiencing overtopping and ensuring that we can maximize the few marsh migration corridors we have here. So this is a partnership in here between the reserve and the foundation, creating space in this area. And so let's see here. So looking specifically at the marsh migration opportunities for this, I have this image. And so this is looking at the slough with 100 centimeters of sea level rise and looking at those flooded areas. And as I mentioned, due to the relatively steep slopes, there's not a lot of opportunities within the slough for future marsh migration. But if there are willing sellers and funding available for these areas, these can be acquired and conserved for marsh migration. However, there are some barriers which point to the urgency we feel to tackle this situation. So we have the main north-south line of Union Pacific Railroad that Amtrak runs on, and it runs right through the middle of the slough. And it's already experiencing overtopping. So this is that main north-south line on king tides and has water cascading over it. As does the road. We have a road that was built below the current sea level after the railroad berm went in. And this too is already experiencing flooding because it's below sea level. So the marsh migration then piece is up this little valley here. And this is what lives up there in the migration corridor. This is an endangered California tiger salamander, freshwater. There's currently a breeding pond up that valley that occasionally goes salty. So the plan then for this part is to expand the ponds above that, outside of sea level rise predictions, and then create a migration corridor and allow that area that they're in currently to become more brackish. So this Ridgeline to Tideline initiative, it really showcases how closely we work together across property lines and jurisdictions to tackle these issues, first at the local scale, and then developing a model that can hopefully be applied more broadly. So that is our intro.
So I think we're ready to turn it over to the next group.
Sounds good. Thank you, Monique and Kevin. I'll kick it over to Seth and Alex to give a couple minute intro about your organization and any notable projects you want to share.
Great. Thank you, Dolores and Mary. Hi, everybody. I'm Seth McKee. I'm the Executive Director of the Scenic Hudson Land Trust, which is part of a larger environmental organization called Scenic Hudson. Joined here today by Alex Wolf, and I'm glad to see some of our Hudson River Estuary Program partners and New York State Department of Environmental Conservation on the call here. So Scenic Hudson, our mission is to sustain and enhance the Hudson Valley's inspirational beauty and health for generations to come. We tried to make our mission statement less of a laundry list the way it used to be and a little more inspirational, and we fit a lot under those short number of words. We got our start in 1963 in the effort to conserve this mountain here, Storm King Mountain, which was proposed for a big hydroelectric plant right into the face of the mountain, would have had major impact on Hudson River fisheries and the landscape writ large. And this was before there was the National Environmental Policy Act, or really, it was before Earth Day, and there really wasn't much environmental advocacy going on in the United States at all. And so this campaign was a 17-year campaign to protect this mountain, is considered the birth of the modern grassroots environmental movement. Went on to a favorable Supreme Court decision and about standing for citizens to voice comment on development, and led to the establishment of the National Environmental Policy Act. So we have environmental advocacy in our DNA. The land trust, the land conservation work came later. In the early 80s, let's say, when our land trust was established. They're two separate not-for-profit corporations. They're nested within each other, though. So it's kind of a highly matrixed situation that we have here at Scenic Hudson. And our accomplishments, we've conserved about 52,000 acres throughout the Hudson Valley for wildlife and biodiversity, clean air and water, scenic beauty. We've created or enhanced over 65 parks, nature preserves, and historic sites, and have conserved over 20,000 acres of productive farmland, about 145 farms. For reference, this is our mission area, just north of New York City here, and Long Island. The Hudson Valley goes up, the part of the Hudson Valley that our mission is really from Albany and the Troy Dam south to the New Jersey line, basically, and on down into lower Westchester and places like that. I think it would be helpful if Alex could just characterize the ecology of our region briefly for everybody.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Seth. So as Seth said, we work in roughly in the 10 counties from just north of New York City up towards Albany on both sides of the Hudson River estuary. Many of you probably know the Hudson River starts in the Adirondacks and goes all the way down to New York City. It is tidal all the way up to about Albany, and it only stops being tidal there because of the federal dam in Troy. So we've got about 150 river miles worth of estuary that we work with, including a number of major tributaries. And the watershed for the Hudson River goes all the way up into the Catskill Mountains, the Adirondacks. It's a huge area, but we focus on the estuary and the lands along the estuary. I'm sure many of you are aware with sort of the estuarine ecosystems, and just to give you a little idea, on the terrestrial side, we are predominantly forested, and we're kind of at the nexus of the central hardwoods region, which is a lot of oak and hickory forest, and the northern forest regions, which is a mix of sugar maple, American beech, hemlock, and white pine. And because we're sort of at the nexus of these ecoregions, and we also have a lot of topographic diversity from obviously sea level at the Hudson up to about 2,000 feet in elevation, pretty close to the river. So there's a lot of biodiversity here from the north and the south, and from lowlands and highlands. Just one example, we are a turtle diversity hotspot for the US with over 10 species of turtles here. And we're one of the only regions that has that kind of turtle diversity.
Looks like Alex froze up.
Oh, no.
Well, let's continue on and let him finish that thought when he comes back in. But I want to just, our conservation priorities reflect kind of everything Alex was just describing. And I want to just go back and quote Kevin as well, when he said that the Elkhorn Sloughs landscape is a landscape of human uses as well. We're very much in the same boat here in the Hudson Valley. The Hudson has been, an area for, the indigenous used it for and continue to use it for millennia. And it's also been, it was a gateway to the colonies and to the Midwest as the Industrial Revolution happened. So we have a lot of infrastructure here, a lot of formerly industrial areas, some industry still, but a huge network of roads and railroads that run right along the Hudson River, as you saw in the Elkhorn Slough case as well. So our conservation priorities, we are hence our name, we protect scenic views from historic sites that you see here. This is the home of the birthplace of American landscape painting, Olana, Frederick Church's home, views from parks, public spaces, and roadways, various habitat conservation efforts, including our region's forests, wetlands, streams, ridges, habitats, and unique geology. We're all about creating access to nature for the public, conserving productive farmland, and working on landscape scale conservation. I want to just turn now to our relationship with the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve, of which we have some folks, on the call here. This was established in 1982. There are 5 sites along the Hudson, totaling about 4,800 acres. You can see them here from the south at Piermont, Iona Island, Norrie Point, Tivoli Bays, and Stockport Flats, all of which have unique tidal habitats and a lot of other resources as well. The reserve is managed by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Our advocacy, this goes back to our role in advocacy. It was key in the 1980s. We advocated strongly with both New York State and the federal government to establish the Hudson River NER because of all these natural values. Features brackish and freshwater tidal wetlands, tidal swamps, submerged aquatic vegetation beds, mudflats, and forests. And just to highlight a couple of projects, as we talked about, we helped get, this is the Piermont Marsh site within the Hudson River NER that is about 325 acres. We advocated for that to be created. You have a creek mouth right here, Piermont Creek, that comes into tidal shallows in this tidal wetland right here, cheek to jowl with a lot of development. And for context, this Piermont is about, I don't know, 50 miles from New York City. You can see it right here, even less. It's very close to New York City. So a lot of development pressure, and we worked with the community. They were hammered by Hurricane Irene back in the early 2010s. Homes flooded out and really devastated the community. But you could see the clear role that the Piermont Marsh has in buffering that flood-prone village from storm surge and sea level rise. And Alex will talk more about our work with establishing a flood resiliency network with our colleagues at the estuary program. In Tivoli Bays, which is up in Dutchess County, about 1,700 acres. This is a large intertidal marsh and cove with mudflats. It is cut off from the Hudson River by, you can see the railroad right here and right here. And it's a wonderful, mosaic of wetlands and streams coming through there. Great place to go kayaking and bird watching. An example of what we've done, there was a 56-acre inholding that was retained by the utility company that sold this land to the state because they thought they were going to build a nuclear power plant, believe it or not, just east of here. That didn't happen. And then in 2006, we were able to negotiate a purchase of this land and then transferred it to the state about a dozen years later. And then up in Stockport, it was about 1,000 acres originally. You could see here, you have a combination of kind of upland islands that are connected to the mainland by tidal wetlands. This is the railroad going right through the smack through the middle of it, just like you saw in the Elkhorn Slough case. We augmented this site with 6 acquisitions totaling 1,400 acres. So it was originally 1,000 acres, this area in here in the river, and then we augmented the site with 6 different acquisitions that you see immediately upland from the original NER, and we've transferred all of that land to the state over time. And I just want to point out, you know, when I started with Scenic Hudson as a project manager, one of my first meetings was with Betsy Blair, who's on this call. She was the former director of the Hudson River NER, and I went to her and we pulled out maps, and she just gave me like a half dozen or 10 or so different absolutely key privately owned properties, and said, Seth, these are the properties that are really important to the Hudson River Estuarine Reserve. And so, you know, we began looking for ways to conserve those lands. And so the 6 acquisitions you see here were part and parcel of that initial meeting with Betsy, and also this one as well at Tivoli Bay. So long history of collaboration between our nonprofit and both the state program and the NER.
Big thanks, Seth.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Betsy. So Alex, you dropped off for a few minutes. I don't know if there's more you wanted to say, but I think that's pretty much the end of my intro. Sorry, it's gone on a little bit long, but was there more? You were on a roll there talking about the ecology of our region. I want to make sure we don't cut you off. Yeah, apologies for the connectivity issues there, but and I'm not sure where I lost everybody, but just to quickly reiterate, you know, we have a lot of topographic diversity here from sea level rise, from sea level up to about 2,000 feet in the Shawangunk, Catskill, and Taconic Mountains. We have a predominantly forested landscape, but there is a lot of agriculture, as Seth mentioned, and a mix of sort of northern and southern species leads to a lot of diversity in our area. I think I'll leave it there for the sake of time.
Great. Thank you, Seth and Alex, and thanks to Monique and Kevin as well. So how this is going to work is we have a couple prepared questions, but for those who are listening in, feel free to think about any questions you might want to ask the panelists. We'll have time at the end. So I'll start with our first prepared question, which is about how you all as land trusts plan and identify what is a priority for your organization. So we're curious about what the approach is to your conservation strategy, and how does the goal of protecting marsh migration corridors impact this strategy? And I don't know if we want to go with the same order of Monique and Kevin first, and then Seth and Alex, or we can just toss it out to all of you.
Finished up, give them a break. So we're going to be pulling up the protected lands map again, as we see. I forgot to mention the ownership pattern here. The reserve, the NER, it's owned by the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state of California. That's in this red area. That's about 1,700 acres. I think they're adding some more land from the department to include into the NER that will bring it up to about 2,500 acres. And that protects the lower slough, where the foundation lands, the land trust lands, are in yellow. So that it's all this kind of upper slough area and then uplands. And then also in the sister wetland, the Morocoho Slough. So that's the protected lands pattern as of today. How we do land acquisition from the foundation standpoint started in the mid-1990s. By then, most of the wetlands had already been protected. The NER had been established. The Nature Conservancy had protected the northern slough. But those activities declined and slowed down. So our board of directors decided to add a land trust function to our Friends of the Reserve role. And so that required, dramatically increasing our capacity and staffing up. And as part of that, they commissioned a watershed conservation plan that involved all the various stakeholders, including the NER and the Nature Conservancy and other entities. And they created this conservation plan in 1999. It was completed. And as part of that included a land acquisition strategy. They identified this main wetland this main ephemeral creek that drains into the slough from the east. And so that was prioritized for willow riparian forest and for wetland. But they were not thinking of sea level rise at that time. So land was still identified as a priority, but then as we realized sea level rise and marsh migration became more important, that increased the priority of these drainages. And this is one in particular that increased the priority as far as an acquisition strategy. Next slide. So what we did as the staff is we took those guidelines and we used standard GIS techniques, geographic information systems techniques, that we're showing here on these two maps, where you can overlay data layers and then do selections between those data layers. On the left, we're looking at the tidal wetland and also the FEMA 100-year floodplain. It's kind of a surrogate for wetlands. And then we overlaid farmland in these green parcels, so we can see where farmland intersects with the floodplain and prioritize those areas in dark blue where they intersect for acquisition. On the right, we're looking at where parcels intersect with the floodplain and wetlands. So this is getting down to parcel level detail. We fleshed out the entire watershed, which is shown in white for the most part. It's showing the watershed in the white background. And so we wanted to create more of a network rather than a patchwork, so that these lands can reinforce each other as far as conservation. And we also wanted to connect our core protected lands to the broader landscape. We wanted to connect to the north to a major river system, also to the south and to the east for to the local mountains. So that would mean that we're not an island of protected land, that we're really part of a regional network. And this takes on more importance with sea level rise and climate change, that wildlife are going to need to move. They're going to need to migrate, and so the habitats we harbor might be different in 100 or 200 years, and so our habitats will need to move, and other habitats will need to move into our area. So we have been using this sort of build out of all these protected lands, and then selecting amongst those for different grant opportunities. So, for example, a recent grant that came up was only looking at land that drains into state waters. So there really is a very small selection of lands that are available for acquisition that drain into state water. So that would be a subset of this larger area. So we've really done a lot of mixing and matching. Another tool that we use that we find really, really important is aerial photography. We seem to have a voracious appetite for current aerial photography. The way we've done that is by using Google Earth is really valuable, because they update their imagery annually, and it's become very high resolution and accurate positionally. But that's hard to bring into the geographic information system. So we purchased some NAPE imagery, that's Department of Agriculture imagery, 15 centimeters in resolution. So you can pick up individual shrubs at that level. And that we acquired that for the entire watershed, and then created a detailed vegetation map based on that. But recently we've been using more drone imagery. So we have a couple of drones, but because they're very good for individual properties, but they're really, really hard to do for large areas. So we're maybe someday we'll get there. We'll be able to use a drone and do our own imagery for the entire watershed, but we definitely fly the drone for particular projects. Because there's a lot of change over time that we need to see, a lot of mysteries we need to solve about how things got the way they were. So aerial photography is really important. I think that's all I had for how we do acquisition strategies.
Great. I just wanted to chime in with a question in the chat while we're on the topic from Jen West. She was wondering if you focus on farmland to take advantage of NRCS funding or for other reasons, or if you just want to expand on your focus on farmland in your priority?
Very good. Yeah, farmland is one of the values that we want to protect, in addition to the natural habitat, sustainable farmland. So we have been acquiring farms, and I have some slides further down that go into how we handle farmland. We're not, there are organizations that focus exclusively on farmland. We're not. We want really that mix of wildlife habitat and farmland. And we have used NRCS funds, the quick grant in particular, but not for acquisitions. That's mostly for projects.
Great. Thank you. Seth?
Okay, well, I will say that our land conservation strategies have evolved over time. Like a lot of land trusts, when we got our start, we were just happy when a landowner wanted to engage with us. And so I think this is a tendency nationwide that land trusts in the 80s and sometimes into the 90s were less discriminating in terms of what type of resources they would protect, what type of lands they would get involved in. And that was true for us as well. But we really started with a more kind of rigorous land conservation strategy in the 2000s. And I'm going to share my screen. This is kind of a composite of our land conservation strategies, which take in a bunch of different things. The areas in purple right along the Hudson River are what we, back in 2007 or so, defined as the lands that matter most. Little self-aggrandizing, but it was, these are really important landscapes. And that was based on both their ecological values through the Natural Heritage Program and our partners at the Hudson River Estuary Program, and scenic views, which there was a whole study done on scenic values along the Hudson by our state Department of State, the Coastal Division, back in the 90s, which informed this. So that was something that informed our work really mid-2000s into the mid-2010s, when we created a food shed conservation plan, which was all about farmland. And to kind of also add on to that answer that Kevin gave, we prioritize farmland among other resources like Elkhorn Slough, in part because it's about 20% of the land base in our region, and also among the most highly developable lands. And we didn't want to see our farmland and that sort of aspect of both the natural and cultural landscape turned into suburban sprawl, basically. So the areas that you see in brown on this map are our food shed priorities. A lot of different areas in the valley, which are not coterminous with the mountaintops that you see, the Hudson Highlands, which is part of the Appalachian chain, and obviously the Catskills and the Schwangunk Ridge. So those were, and that was we put out a food shed conservation plan around 2014 that really defined the types of farmland we were looking to conserve. And then in about 2016 or so, we came up with something called the Hudson Valley Conservation Strategy, which was we took the Nature Conservancy's kind of approach to resilient landscape conservation and applied it to our region using a software called MarkSan, where it divided up our entire region into 10-acre pixels, 10-acre hexagons, and then ranked them according to their overall irreplaceability from a climate resiliency and biodiversity standpoint. And this is an iterative software system where, as soon as we conserve another parcel of land, we can plug that into the system, and then it recalibrates where the important parcels are, with the goal of creating a network of resilient lands that are conserved and can be conserved. And that, what you see, what I just described, is basically the priorities are in green that you see on this map. And you can see there's a lot of landscape connectivity involved and aspired landscape connectivity going forward. So that's kind of a snapshot of the evolution of our land conservation strategy. I would say it's gotten more technical and sophisticated each decade. And so at this point, we are focused on knitting together these resilient lands and also factoring in marsh migration. And so I will turn it over to Alex to talk about our approach to sea level rise and marsh migration.
Thanks, Seth. So Seth was talking about our Hudson Valley conservation strategy there, which, as he mentioned, is sort of this GIS and mark sand model that incorporates a number of different data sources, including a lot from New York State and from the Nature Conservancy. But because we're able to input multiple sort of valued lands, types of valued land into that, we also did an analysis. Actually, my predecessor did this circa 2014. 2015, we used the SLAM model, sea levels affecting marshes model, which probably many folks on this call have encountered. So we did that at the local level in the Hudson estuary to try to identify places that are currently tidal wetlands that would be impacted by sea level rise. As I was trying to explain earlier, we've got about 150 river miles of estuary. And the salinity decreases as you get farther and farther from the ocean. And so we actually have a number of freshwater tidal wetlands, tidal marshes, and tidal swamps, which I understand is a fairly rare habitat type in a lot of the US. So Seth, if you want to go to the next slide. So we really wanted to see sort of how these wetlands would be impacted by sea level rise and then feed that into that HVCS model for the region as a whole to inform our priorities. And so we did this SLAM analysis, which we call protecting the pathways, quite fittingly. I'll plop this URL into the chat as soon as I'm done talking here. We came out with sort of a report that you see pictured here that's for a general audience. We also have a peer review paper that's also on that website. And Seth, if you'll go to the next slide. We also created a story map that really explains sort of for a general audience, what is SLAM, what is sea level rise, why are these places worth protecting, and then kind of delves into the details of our findings. And what we found is because of the topography of this region, in a lot of places, the Hudson estuary has pretty steep shorelines that don't allow for much movement or much migration of these wetlands, just topographically. We found that a lot of the marshes like Piermont Marsh, which Seth pictured earlier, were actually going to struggle to survive sea level rise just because of their current elevations. But we found 3 areas in particular that had a lot of potential for marsh migration well into the future. And so Seth, if you want to go to the next slide, please. One of those places is called the Bindenkill. The Bindenkill is a small tributary to the Hudson that you can see sort of starting at the top of the map there. And the area outlined in red here is kind of this lowland. This was actually a series of islands, and a lot of the back channels were kind of filled in by dredging by the Army Corps over the last several decades. And so the 4 panels of this map are sea level rise under a couple different scenarios through 2100. And our SLAM analysis reflected this as well. We saw that a lot of this area was going to be increasingly inundated. As you may guess by the aerial imagery here, a lot of this is currently farmed. And so we started kind of working with the current landowners. So if you want to click one more time there, Seth. In the middle here, I'm going to pop up the parcel map so you can see sort of current sea level rise and high sea level rise scenarios for 2100 on either side still. And then the parcels in the middle with that red area outline there, that's the lowland Bindenkill area. So the parcels here in yellow, we were able to conserve in fee, and those are currently sort of preserved lands. There's some green parkland owned by one of the townships nearby at the north end there. That blue is owned by the state of New York. That's essentially fill lands that we've been trying to conserve as well. And then all of the sort of pink overlay is private lands. And we've been able to work with at least some of the landowners to achieve conservation easements. And that's the sort of pink with the black cross hatching there. So this is just one example of where we use that SLAM analysis to really highlight areas that we knew would be places where marshes were likely to either keep being there or to actually grow in size and migrate with sea level rise. And we took action to try to conserve those lands. And that kind of work is certainly ongoing for some of the other sites that we identified too.
That's great, Alex. It's a great example. I did want to add in a question from David in the chat. Since we're on this topic, I'm thinking I'll just blend in some questions in the chat as we go along. This question is for Elkhorn Slough. He's curious if your farm acquisitions are fee simple ownership or if they are conservation easements. And is the goal for the farming to continue, or are you acquiring to then do habitat restoration?
It's actually all of that. We mostly focus on fee acquisition, but we do have of our 300 acres of conservation easements, 200 acres of them is on a working ranch that has about 60 acres of farmland. But it's fee interest is a better tool to use when you need to do restoration on the land. In our experience, that the conservation easement tool is harder to do because you're having to work with a private landowner. But our goal, and I have some other slides coming up here soon that that will show how we try to reconfigure the farm footprint so it's more sustainable. Some of the farms were on steep slopes and didn't have adequate erosion control infrastructure. I mentioned those sandy hills to the east of the slough. They're highly erodible and really tough to farm. But strawberries are one of our cash crops, and they love well-drained sandy soils. So that's one of the crops that we have. But we definitely do reduce the farm footprint and then continue to lease that out to small farmers. So I think we have 5 or 6 small farms, small organic farms that we lease out for a variety of reasons. We can support the farming economy. We have a presence on the land. We have a link to the farming community. There's lots of reasons to have small farmers.
Great, thank you, Kevin. I think, oh, sorry, I'm just reading your, oh, Alex, you're dropping the link to the story map. Yeah, I encourage everyone to check it out, especially folks on the Pathways to Resilience project. As we're thinking about how to focus on priority marsh migration corridors, I think this is a really, great topic to be thinking about conservation priorities for these land trusts. So I'm going to move on to our second question, which is that a lot of folks in this call today are, part of a reserve that's either part of a state agency or a university. So I think we would love to learn more about how land trusts work and any strategies you all might suggest for partnering with a land trust, especially if a reserve isn't positioned within or is positioned within a state agency, but not necessarily directly within the conservation division of that state agency. I don't know who wants to start. Again, we'll let Elkhorn Slough go.
I've got it queued up, so here we
Great.
go. So the Elkhorn Slough NER was established in 1979, and a reserve advisory committee was formed from the community and businesses in the area, and their role was to guide the development of the reserve. And this committee helped establish the Elkhorn Slough Foundation in 1982 to help support those reserve programs. So the foundation started the education, research, and volunteer programs, and programs were eventually turned over to the reserve. So this is our model, our Venn diagram. So here we have the reserve in the middle. Where's my little pointer here? Reserve in the middle. We have NOAA as the primary funding agency for the reserve, partnered with a state organization, which in this case is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then the Elkhorn Slough Foundation serving as the fiscal agent. And we have, I think there's about 8 state employees here. There's additional 15 people who make up the reserve staff, and the land trust has about a dozen more. Those NER staff that are employed, the NER staff that are employed through the Elkhorn Slough Foundation with NOAA funding, they report programmatically to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and administratively to the nonprofit. And so having this type of a partnership, it allows the reserve to be more flexible and nimble. The foundation can accumulate cash reserves to buffer the NER program expenses. And this partnership has evolved over 42 years, and it's held together by an MOU.
I wanted to cover a little bit about the land trust for folks in the NER world. Land trusts are 501c3 nonprofit corporations. They're treated by the IRS just like any other charity, such as the United Way or the Red Cross. We are community supported, so we don't get regular funding from state agencies other than grants. So we have to raise our funds from the community. So we have memberships, and we really try to reflect the community's interests. And we're also non-activist. We talked a little bit about this before we started, but we've decided to follow the Nature Conservancy model, where we work with every sector that is important to work for conservation. So we don't weigh in for or against certain development projects, but we will provide information. And so that's, I think, probably the standard model for land trusts around the country.
Great perspective. Thanks.
So I'll just add first, that was a great description of what land trusts are. Kevin, thank you for that. And that's a great Venn diagram, Wendy, in terms of like the relationship between the NER and your state agency, et cetera. There could be a very similar Venn diagram for the Hudson River NER, that it works directly with both NOAA and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and Hudson River Estuary Program. It's less, there's no formal relationship between Scenic Hudson and those other entities, but as I said, we've been involved since the advocacy for the establishment of the Hudson River NER, and there's just a great flow of information between both the NER and our estuary program that informs our land conservation strategy. Going back to, as I mentioned, those early days when I sat down with Betsy Blair and we kind of, plotted out the acquisition strategy for the Hudson River NER over time. The Hudson River, Hudson River Estuary Program, which has a direct relationship with the NER, has a management advisory committee. We, Scenic Hudson staff, sit on that along with many other stakeholders. So there's that similar kind of public input as well. But I would say, writ large, land trusts can be much more nimble than state agencies in terms of responding to opportunities in the real estate market. That's been kind of the role we have played, as well as others throughout the country, really. State agencies have, processes that can make them less able to compete in a real estate market that's active. And so we've been able to acquire lands both for the NER and also for other state agencies that, we've been able to kind of buy and hold for several years before the state can catch up to us in terms of securing funding and all that. I will also say that sometimes, public, both state and federal appraisal processes can be fairly, I would say, rigid, and we are able to work with independent appraisers and still get credible appraisals, but we have a little more latitude in sort of interpreting what a justifiable value and then leading to a purchase price might be. And sometimes that means we end up selling for less to the state than we acquired it for, but we try to make sure we get made whole at the end of the day. But at some level, it's a cost of doing business to conserve critical landscapes that land trusts take on. So I think that role as a pre-acquisition entity for both the NER and state conservation agencies is really a critical role that land trusts can play. And then, that some of the studies that Alex shared, our Hudson River Conservation Strategy, basically our climate resilience strategy, the tidal wetlands pathways study that we did. I mean, all of that is information that then can be fed into, state level prioritization. So, again, it depends on the size and capacity of the land trust, but there's a lot of room for that sort of partnership between both state agencies, the NERs, and land trusts.
Great, thank you, Seth. Alex,
I don't know,
who else?
Alex, you want to add to that? Sorry.
No, I think you said it well, Seth.
Great. Yes, that was really helpful. Thank you, Seth. My last prepared question is kind of about the people side of things. So both your organizations have really impressive track records. You know, you've protected thousands of acres in both Central California and New York's Hudson River Valley. So we were curious if you could share some insights on how to build consensus among diverse stakeholders and really connections between people and land conservation that are really needed to make this work happen. So if you could share any insights about, you know, certain stories or.
Yeah, we've got a few stories. So regarding building consensus among stakeholders, our role has been to participate in other efforts, such as being on technical advisory committees that are project specific, but also planning for regional connectivity. We've been part of a group that's trying to link our local mountain ranges together for wildlife movement. We've been working also with Caltrans on advanced mitigation, which is, you know, a huge story in and of itself. Forming I guess working with a group that developed a memorandum of understanding on how to do advanced mitigation that contained a lot of elements. The ones that are important for me were that the California Transportation Agency, one of the elements of this memorandum was that they would acquire land early before it's developed and while it's less expensive, and also invest in land that is part of an existing conservation plan so that there's an organization potentially willing to take on that land and care for it for forever. Now, how we connect people to land, as land trusts know that that's very important, that our work won't persist unless we have a sense of the community as bought into and support our work. And so we try to foster that with investing in public access, and also more recently in education. We've established an outdoor classroom under a massive oak tree next to an elementary school, and we've set up programs to bring those kids out to that classroom. They actually walk from the school to this tree and then learn about natural resources out in the field. And then we're also establishing a trail from that outdoor classroom to an old historic house that we're renovating as a community center that will potentially involve after school programs to help for working parents. Now we're going to share a slide here on looking at farmland. I wanted to touch on the farmland issue a little more. You know, farming is the basis of our economy in Monterey County, and in particular, North Monterey County, where we're located. Farming is entirely dependent on groundwater, and groundwater has been dropping from over pumping. And so as we acquired these lands in green and then looked at the footprint of agriculture in kind of a beige color there, we identified areas that were suitable for retiring farmland. And so we reduced the farm footprint to what we're showing as magenta shapes there. And then we were able to then look at how much water we're leaving in the ground by retiring this farmland. And it turns out that we're leaving in the ground about 1 million gallons a year of water, and that addresses about half of the groundwater overdraft. So the groundwater is still dropping, but half as fast using those numbers. But what we're not factoring in is how much water we're increasing from groundwater recharge, because we're converting impermeable surfaces to natural habitat, and that should increase groundwater recharge, especially in these sandy hills that we're working on. These are, again, the sand dune areas. And so we're working to quantify that. So we really have made huge strides towards stabilizing the groundwater level. So we need to nail that down a little better. But what we're hoping to do is, by increasing groundwater, we will be protecting wells that are shallow for either small farmers or residences that are relying on well water and that don't have a water service agency that services them. And so by creating this freshwater, what we're calling a lens at the edge of saltwater, we're hoping to block seawater intrusion and then protect these folks that are working with shallow wells. So that's how we're working with the farming community. And I think that's what I had to cover for this topic.
So I have a couple of thoughts and then invite Alex to talk about our work with the Hudson River Flood Resiliency Network. But I think, how to create consensus among diverse stakeholders. Some of it is getting information out there. And we had put together a kind of an offshoot of our Scenic Hudson website. It was a sea level rise kind of predictor tool, which allowed a user to kind of toggle between different scenarios and see what the implications are of different levels of sea level rise along the Hudson, because again, the Hudson, as Alex said, is tidal. So we're anticipating some significant impacts there. And so that kind of information and giving the user the ability to toggle around in there and see, because everyone wants to see how it's going to affect their community or their house. And people love to sort of drill down to that level. And so creating accessible information that can help people to visualize, the what's at stake is really important. I think finding common agendas, Scenic Hudson has, we entered into a couple of spaces with some suspicion, I would say, early on, and one of those groups was kind of hunting groups, and the other was the agricultural community. And some of it's rooted in kind of preconceptions of what we're about based on our advocacy work, which is a good reason why a lot of land trusts stay out of advocacy. But we've sort of leaned into it, chin first in a lot of ways. But when we first started, reaching out to the sporting community, the hunting and fishing groups, there was just kind of a cultural suspicion about conservation. And what we found was common advocacy platforms in our state capital in Albany to advocate on, really about something arcane to do with landowner liability for opening lands to private recreation. And so we had groups of hunters and land trust people going in and lobbying state legislators together to make it easier for lands to be open to recreation. That really built bridges with the hunting community. And that has led today to we're trying to expand hunting on some of our properties as a forest management tool to help promote forest regeneration due to deer overpopulation. The white-tailed deer is really endemic in our region in terms of its population growth. And so we're building bridges that way. Again, we have a resource. Hunters would like to utilize a resource. We're finding ways to, increase access for them, which is, that's a great bridge builder. And then with farmland, when we first started doing farmland conservation easements, there was this preconception that because we're Scenic Hudson, we're going to be wanting to include all kinds of restrictions in our easements about what color people can paint their barns and things like that. And so we, after running into kind of this suspicion, we set up an advisory committee that included farmers from different agricultural sectors. And we sort of hammered out a template conservation easement that, ensured both a lot of flexibility for agriculture, but also was protective of soils and natural resources as well. So I think some of it is, finding those common elements to either advocate about or focus on collaboratively. And other times it's about pulling people together who have time to give and trying to hammer something out in a fairly transparent way. It's never easy, but I think it's really critical if we want to continue to maintain levels of public support for this kind of work going forward. But one thing that Scenic Hudson was pretty instrumental in, along with our state partners, was establishing what we call the Flood Resiliency Network. And Alex has been involved in that for several years, working with communities like Piermont that you saw in the aerial earlier and others. So I thought it'd be good if he could describe that initiative a bit.
Sure. Thanks, Seth. Yeah, Seth mentioned this region was hit really hard by tropical storms Lee and Irene in 2011, and then Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And certain communities in the Hudson Valley were just absolutely hammered, absolutely reeling, and it sort of felt like it came out of nowhere. These are tropical storms, and some of the flooding that we had was way up tributaries, way inland, people that never had to think about hurricanes before. And so Seth talked about sharing resources, and I think one of the resources that Scenic Hudson was able to share with these communities was some technical expertise on climate science and on interpreting climate science, and making it more available to general audiences, and GIS, digital mapping, and understanding sea level rise and being able to map out flood risk. And we started working really closely with a few communities in the Hudson Valley, with funding support from the state, to really, sit down in communities with task forces and say, where's your critical infrastructure? Where is flooding happening now? Where is it going to happen in the decades to come? And started sort of building these sea level rise and flooding risk maps with these communities. And the first iteration was with a few communities individually, and the next iteration with more support from the state through funding and with partners like the Hudson River Estuary Program and DEC and the Hudson River NER, was sort of getting some of these communities together and talking to each other and sharing sort of commonalities, challenges, successes across the estuary. And it kind of evolved into our co-founding with the partners I was mentioning and some others, this flood resilience network. And the goal is to sort of get communities up and down the Hudson River estuary in the same room, talking about these issues and understanding them. And again, we sort of brought the mapping expertise and the climate science expertise to the table, and tried to be a resource for these communities to understand, what's going to happen, what's at risk, and what are some of the ways to deal with these problems. And so the Flood Resilience Network is moving forward under its own steam now, very happily. We're still on the advisory committee for it, but I think that gave us a way to, under our really broad mission that Seth shared earlier, sort of help keep the people in the Hudson Valley, able to be prosperous, be healthy, be safe. And that's another great way, I think, to build bridges and sort of finding that common ground of what are the challenges that we're all facing, and what can we do collectively to think about it and hash through action.
Great, thank you, Alex. Thanks for your answers to all of our panelists. I wanted to give some time for anyone in the audience to ask any questions to our panelists. Our conservation leaders, any conservation question you might have, now is the time to ask it.
And for those of us who are part of the Pathways to Resilience project, I'm really curious if any of the topics we've touched on today resonate with you in your own journey at your reserve with your partners in figuring out what your niche is for making way for wetlands, or actually doing the work.
Jen?
Oops. Hello. Yeah, I always have a question. Thanks everyone. That was really helpful. I guess I am wondering how much you feel like you led the process or not in communities to get this done. And I'll try to explain further. So in Rhode Island, we're trying to go to each coastal community, and we have parcel level SLAM mapping and showing them the tool and saying, okay, here's all these great opportunities, and here's a list of funding sources, and how can we help you? And then we wait to hear back, and then we don't, because sometimes they have a ton of priorities, or they're just like, oh, that means we'd have to talk to private landowners, and that's hard. And so, and I think it depends on the town, but I guess it's do you feel like the local land trusts are pretty resourced and like empowered to take a big role in this, or do you feel like you've had to kind of lead it and like but I feel like I'm bugging towns to a certain degree, right? Like, come on, do this. Let's go. Come on, you can do it. You should be, have you talked to this person yet? Have you done this? And I don't know if you can just give a sense of your role versus local, hyper local land trust and other groups' roles.
Well, I'll say, and Alex, I think the dynamics in the flood resiliency network will be interesting to tease out here, but you know, sometimes crises are the motivator that really gets people's attention and local government's attention. And I think in our case, the superstorms that Alex mentioned were just so devastating, and communities were looking for answers. And so that was how we got a lot of participation in this. I'm not in any way saying, oh, so it was a good thing we had these superstorms, but more that sometimes because local governments are strapped and they're juggling lots of priorities, when something like this hits them, it can suddenly create space for looking for solutions and more, perhaps in some cases, you know, local political receptivity to it. I think, you know, our state partners were rock solid, you know, in their you know, assistance that they offered to communities as well. So I think it was a great partnership between Scenic Hudson and the Hudson River Estuary Program, New York State, DEC. In terms of local land trusts, they are more, you're right, Jen, they're generally less resourced, but they have tremendous community contacts sometimes. And, you know, we're a regional organization. We work in 10 counties and we don't have the same level of relationships that local land trusts do. And so sometimes they can bring people to the table that that we're more challenged to do. But you're right. I mean, it's the larger groups sometimes that you know, we can afford to have an amazing you know, ecologist like Alex on our staff to be able to do lots of great research and studies. Smaller land trusts don't have that luxury necessarily. But I think, you know, Alex, in terms of the flood resiliency network, I you know, there was obviously in the early 2010s, there was a huge amount of attention and effort going into that in the wake of the superstorms. I don't know what your sense of the level of kind of local investment in it or interest is at this point.
Yeah, I think for flood resilience and for a lot of the other sort of community-based work that we do, you know, we've gotten involved with things like solar siting issues and thinking about, you know, how we can be proactive instead of reactive on making sure that solar goes in places where it's not negatively impacting other resources as much as possible. But you know, whether it's flooding or solar, or climate change, conservation, a lot of these things, I think, at least in New York, where there is a lot of power at the municipal level to sort of do master planning and thinking about this stuff, it often comes down to one change maker to sort of get interested and consume the knowledge that we have to offer and then run with it. And it, you know, when you can find that one person that's really invested in helping their town deal with, you know, flooding or whatever it is, conservation, farming, you name it. I think, again, I think of us as sort of a technical provider in some ways. We're giving them information, the tools to how to think about the topic and sort of some pathways forward. And when you connect with that one person, a lot of times they can make the change because, you know, once they bring it to their neighbors, they can be very convincing when they're invested in it.
And I think for Elkhorn Slough, we feel like a lot of that consensus building is happening within the NER. You know, we have a lot of programs. We have the volunteer program that brings our volunteers together. They get a lot of information. They're definitely from the community. We have our education program, reaching out to the schools in the region, and coastal training program, also building that consensus. And then here at Elkhorn Slough, we have the tidal wetland program, and that's a broad collaborative effort. And so that brings in a lot of the agencies and science stakeholders to really work through collaboratively a lot of the issues that we face in the region.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for your great presentations and great work.
Thanks, Jen. I see another question in the chat. generally to our panelists, is anyone doing research / establishing monitoring in pathways for marsh migration to understand how it's playing out and inform this work going forward? It's a little bit adjacent to land conservation, but under this topic of marsh migration.
So we do have a lot of research going on, and it's through the NER. And that is because we are looking at the marsh migration pathways, and we're looking at digital elevation models. We do have a technical paper that diagram that I showed you, that image of sea level rise. We've done a lot of looking at shifts in habitat to see where those marsh migration corridors would be. So I think our research department, our research program here at the NER is really heavily involved in understanding a lot of those issues and forward thinking on gathering data and understanding marsh migration and where that's going to happen and what that means in terms of developing new marsh there and what's happening to our older marsh.
Go ahead, Alex. I was going to suggest, Alex, if you want to talk about what our former SCA was, the research she was doing at Ramshorn Marsh regarding, kind of correlating tidal surges and what was happening on the land. But you have other things probably to talk about as well.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great suggestion, Seth. So Ramshorn Preserve, just very briefly, is another one of these freshwater tidal areas. It has both freshwater tidal marsh and swamp. Ramshorn is a small tributary to the Hudson, and so Scenic Hudson has preserved part of it, and New York Audubon has another part conserved in fee. And so this is a place where we expect some marsh migration. We expect possibly some wetland loss. And so we actually had one of our Student Conservation Association interns looking at data that's been collected. So we had a sort of a set of photos of trail conditions under various flooding situations. And there's a nearby tide station that I think is actually maintained by the Hudson River NER at Turkey Point. And so we were sort of basically using the timestamps to look back at, okay, when we see a foot of water on this trail at our preserve, what is the tide gauge? What's the tide gauge at? And then, okay, how often does the tide gauge hit that level? And we're able to gauge the frequency of flooding at a certain level back through time over the last few years since that tide station was set up. And this is I think is a really great way that almost any, park manager, preserve manager, or anybody that manages trails, roads, whatever, can sort of use crowdsourced photos and the nearest tide gauge to kind of benchmark how often flooding is happening and how often it might be happening going forward. So we have been able to do that analysis, and that certainly helped us understand sort of the frequency with which that trail becomes unusable and how that might change going forward.
That's really interesting, Alex. Thank you. And I did want to make a plug that we had some previous webinars as part of this Pathways to Resilience learning series. I just wanted to make a plug for a previous webinar from Grant McKown, who is a researcher at UNH, and he spoke a lot about the different drivers of marsh migration and touched a lot more on this concept of monitoring and researching marsh migration on the ground. So if you want to take a look at that webinar, it's recorded and up on our Pathways to Resilience NERO webpage. He has some great studies that he did a synthesis all along the East Coast, and there's a lot of different monitoring and research studies that he describes in his webinar. So just wanted to plug that.
Yeah, I should also plug our some of our Flood Resilience Network partners at NOAA's Sea Grant program, Sea Grant New York. There is sort of a program called My Coast. It's an app for smartphones that is available for many states now, I think, and it enables anybody with the app to just basically take photos of flooding or storm damage and submit it to a centralized database. And so when you think about, again, sort of matching tide gauge data to these crowdsourced images of flooding, I think My Coast can be a great source of those images if you don't have photos of your sites going back.
Definitely we love my coast here in Rhode Island too. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I'm curious if the panelists have any questions for the group.
I actually sort of thought Ingrid's question might be directed to the NER community at large. I wonder if others are doing marsh migration monitoring at other NER sites.
I can say that we are starting to do that at the Narragansett Bay Research Reserve in Rhode Island. We have an ecotones monitoring protocol that's trying to be, built out to better capture marsh migration. So, and I think that there are talks within the system of trying to do that at more reserves and in a more comprehensive way. So I don't know if others on the call are doing that at their sites too.
Well, this is Betsy. I just want to add that many of the reserve sites have established surface elevation tables to monitor what's happening with the marsh surface. It's tied into NOAA surveyed, geodetic surveyed tide gauges. And often those transects span gradients up into areas where the marsh would be migrating, as they certainly in the Hudson.
And I should add that the ecotones monitoring is really centered around vegetation. But I think when I say trying to build it out, we mean capturing other drivers of marsh migration. So looking at maybe soils and tying that into our sea level rise predictions and things like that. So. And I see Elaine in the chat says several reserves are also participating right now in a marsh modeling community of practice call. Another sign of interest in this topic. Yes, I think that call is happening right now at the same time. We can share more about that, that effort to our Pathways to Resilience project team, and we can share it beyond that as well, if those are not familiar with what Elaine is mentioning.
I'm curious if there are other NERs that are working closely with land trusts across the country. In anything like what Elkhorn, Slough, and Scenic Hudson have been describing here.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Ellen from the North Carolina Reserve, and Seth, I'll answer your question with a question. And we work with the North Carolina Coastal Land Trust, which serves the entire coastline of North Carolina, on acquiring properties. And we're actually working with them right now to try and reach out to willing sellers or find willing sellers for some inholdings we have within our property boundaries. But we have not started the conversation with that land trust or the Nature Conservancy or other partners regarding nonprofit partners regarding marsh migration. And so I'm curious from your perspective and Elkhorn Slough Foundation's perspective, if you are seeing a lot of enthusiasm and energy in the land trust community to work on marsh migration, and if that is kind of coming up through the land trust organizations, or if it's really coming out on kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on what the local interest is in that topic. Thanks.
I think for us, we have kind of a unique coastal community, which is, it's 150 miles long and really narrow along the Hudson River. And most of the local land trusts they're focused on a much broader landscape, usually within their county or sub-region. And the Hudson River coastal area is a small fraction of what they do. So I think it hasn't been a huge priority for most of the smaller land trusts. It's more been kind of the regional organizations like us that have taken that on. The California experience may be different, but leave it to them to describe that.
Yeah, I can add to that. I actually reflect the same sentiment that you did regarding small land trusts and not really focusing much on marsh migration. But, you know, I think land trusts are really focused on wetlands and wetland drainages and streams. And so kind of by default, that gets them involved with marsh migration. And so, you know, in our case, you know, we're seeing these freshwater ponds or these rare amphibians that are in danger of sea level rise and seawater inundation. So you're, you know, kind of looking at, you know, how do we get these animals out of harm's way? How do we create habitat that's out of harm's way? And so we're definitely working on that. But what I see regionally is more wildlife connectivity being the emphasis. So rather than marsh migration per se, it's more connecting the landscape. And so for us, you know, connecting our watershed to the broader landscape, 20 years ago, that was kind of a far off dream, but now it's becoming far more realistic and far more promising. So we really are likely to be making significant progress in linking our watershed to other watersheds to the east.
Those are helpful perspectives. Thank you. I like that, the kind of reframing of it and thinking about the different groups' priorities and how to match them up and take them to the next step. Thank you. And thanks for your great presentations and work.
We have about 1 more minute. I was going to see if there was one more question, but what do you think, Dolores? Are we just about on time?
We're doing splendidly, and I think if anyone did have one quick question or comment they wanted to share, either from the whole group or the panel, we'd have time for it.
I can add something along those lines is regarding leveraging regional land use planning. So we've been, as I said, working with the California Transportation Agency in trying to help identify mitigation properties. And as part of that effort, we are gathering lots of information on properties that we otherwise wouldn't have obtained that information. So working with them, we're really expanding our database of understanding the nuances of smaller properties. And the California Transportation Agency has taken that information and has actually begun making progress on acquiring lands that are important for habitat and that satisfy potentially their mitigation needs. So we're definitely making progress there.
That's an exciting partnership, Kevin. That's really, really cool transfer of information. Yeah, I mean, we are a little bit, you know, 3:31 now on the East Coast anyway. Mary, I mean, if anyone wants to continue the conversation, I can keep this open. You know, Roka's holding the Zoom space, so anyone who wants to stay and keep chatting can. But, you know, I'd like to thank Mary and all of the panelists for the great conversation today. We will take this recording, and unless the panelists object or anybody sends us an email to say I object, we'll make it available at the webpage at NERA.org, just like we have with the other webinars where it's been okay to share them. And all the great resources that Alex was popping into the chat will go into the learning guide that we're putting together as part of this project, where we're bringing kind of like an Amazon of all the resources that the teams are uncovering, and we're learning along the way for folks who want to do this work in the system in the future. Mary, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that was great. I just really appreciate everyone for taking the time today.
Yeah, me as well. And I agree with Lynn. Today is very inspiring. I feel a little bit lighter than I did when I started the call. It's great.